We're exploring a town that is completely gone, lost by every meaning of the word, more so than any ghost town that we've explored on this channel.
This is the Lausanne site.
The site that we're visiting was called Lausanne, home of a tavern, a sawmill, a couple houses, and not much else. Yet despite the size of the settlement, some historians claim that it played a critical role in kickstarting America's Industrial Revolution.
I would say at that time, when it was the busiest, there was probably 10 people stationed here.
We're stopping at several interesting ruins along the way, following along a lost highway, a deserted turnpike through the woods that once held the title of the most dangerous public road in America, thanks to robbers and bandits that once lurked in these woods.
There were a lot of cases of people missing, finding dead bodies and skeletons.
This is the story of the old settlement of Lausanne, the town that never was, on Part-Time Explorer. It's quiet on this riverbank, a spot frequented only by the occasional fisherman or excursion train heading through the valley. But less than 2 miles downriver, it's a whole different world. The nearby town of Jim Thorpe is a popular tourist destination, especially during the spring and fall, with the Lehigh Gorge Scenic Railroad taking passengers up the Lehigh River on excursions to see the changing forest colors. Jim Thorpe was named for a Native American Olympic athlete, but before him the town was known as Mauch-Chunk, meaning bare place in Lenni Lenape, the language of the local Indian tribe. This beautiful town, winding up the canyon, is popularly advertised as the Switzerland of America. But before Jim Thorpe had that title, it was Lausanne that was called the Switzerland of America. In fact, chances are the name Lausanne itself likely originates from the city in Switzerland of the same name. Lausanne itself was nothing more than a town that tried to happen. So much development was going on around it, from railroads to coal mines to boat building, that things should have fallen into place, but competition from Mauch-Chunk to the south and other settlements in the area ultimately never gave Lausanne a proper start. It was barely ever even a town and more of a hamlet. It started with a sawmill being built at the mouth of the Nesquehoning Creek, but not long afterward, in 1791, coal was discovered in the mountains behind it, and the sawmill was then needed to construct boats to ship the coal down the river to the big cities. The land around the sawmill was platted out and lots were sold off, but very little was built there. We'll get more into the history of Lausanne if we're able to actually reach the site, but let's take a look at our path there first. I'm joined on my journey by local historian and author Vince Hydro, who's been studying Lausanne and Mauch-Chunk history for decades and even self-published the definitive book on the town, titled Carbon County's Lost Village of Lausanne. So have you been down there before?
Oh yes, since I was a kid.
We need to enter the woods following an ancient road, a road with just as much history as the town that we're going to. It began as the Great Indian Warrior's Path and stretched from Alabama to New York. It connected the Native American tribes of the Appalachian Mountains and surrounding areas along a long footpath dating back who knows how long. These paths were often indicated by trees that were grown in an unnaturally bent shape, like this example right here. As colonists came to the area and settled in Pennsylvania, they used the trail too. As the sawmill at Lausanne developed and coal was found in the area, road developers came through and, following the trails already somewhat cleared by the Warrior's Path, they widened the route and cleared the roads further.
Yeah, how'd this get here?
The first road project was in the 1790s and was known as the Evan Owen Road, and this was improved in 1806 when the Lehigh and Susquehanna Turnpike was built on top of it. This was a toll road with taverns and rest stops along the way and was wide enough for large stagecoaches to travel along. We're following that old turnpike right now, and at the southern terminus of it, in the direction that we're going, is Lausanne. This is the 1806 Turnpike. This is the 1790s Evan Owen Road. This is the great Indian warrior path. So much history along this lonely trail, and it's just abandoned here in this forest, quietly fading away.
A little ways up the turnpike from the actual town site of Lausanne is a cluster of old stone buildings that is always mistaken to be Lausanne. Most exploration videos you see on YouTube go explore that site, and they call it Lausanne, but it is absolutely not Lausanne. They're an unnamed cluster of powder magazines that Vince calls James Run. We're going to explore those now.
As we made our way down the old turnpike, we came to our first ruin. We're still quite a ways from the Lausanne town site, but this is one of the stone ruins regularly mislabeled as Lausanne. This is the first of two powder magazines built by the DuPont Powder Company in 1836 along the Lausanne Turnpike. This is the larger of the two, with a capacity of 10,000 kegs of gunpowder. These magazines were built to store black powder for resale in the area. It could be used for all sorts of purposes, including hunting rifles, but their primary customers were the coal mines of the mountains, for use in blasting out their tunnels.
And mule teams would carry the powder from these magazines to the mines. And I have a letter that was written to me when I was a kid from the descendant of one of the teamsters. This man drove mule teams over the hill that carried some of this powder. See where there was some later repairs made with a different type of cement.
I wonder why some of these stones stick out.
That's a good question, and I don't have the foggiest idea why they stick out. But apparently there was a purpose, because you see them from time to time. Yeah, it is strange, because the rest of them are nice and they're cut nice, and then there has to be a reason why they were.
You can see where the floor was carved out, and these would have been beams coming across. So it was actually open underneath the floor as well. That was probably to make sure the ground didn't get too wet and keep the powder dry.
Directly across the old turnpike from the first magazine is the second, smaller one, which had a capacity of 5,000 kegs of powder. Looking at the site, we noticed signs of an explosion. Could this magazine have blown up at one point?
There's stories that one of these exploded, but we really don't know whether they just fell in over time or whether there was an explosion. There could have been.
We continued down the turnpike, reminiscing about what traveling this road back in its heyday was like, or even back in the Native American days when it connected the tribes of Alabama all the way up to the Indians of Canada. We can see just how steep some of these roads are at points. Stagecoaches in the early days didn't have brakes, so as they came through places like this, they often dragged logs behind them to slow them down. The next structure that we came to was what remained of a destroyed stone arch bridge. This bridge carried the turnpike across the James Run Creek and was probably built with the construction of the Susquehanna and Lehigh Turnpike in 1806.
So the earlier roads, they were state roads, and they had no requirements in terms of river crossing. The horses just basically forded the river. But the turnpike was required to have a bridge over every stream and creek and river. And so this is what they built here.
It was said to have still been in operational condition in 1911.
So you can see how the bridge had an extensive, ramp up to it. Because it was fairly high. You can see over there how high it was.
Someone left their boots here. A little way farther down the road and then through the brush on the north side is the next ruin, a sawmill. Now, this is not the sawmill that created the town of Lausanne that I mentioned earlier. We'll get to that one soon enough. This one here came later.
Some of the earliest houses in Nesquehoning were built with wood cut at this sawmill, and that basically they had a wooden sluice from way up in the headlands of James's Run that would use water to float the logs down to this sawmill. And the water wheel was on the right-hand side there.
So for this sawmill here, up there, the mill race deviates from the creek. This is James's Run, and the water would come down here. You can still see the notch for the mill race coming right through here, and the water wheel, made of wood, would stick out the stone building right here and go down into the water, and then the race would continue on down and rejoin James's Run right there.
And that probably would have ran up into the 1870s, I would have thought, maybe a little bit longer.
We actually know the name of the man who operated this mill. His name was Billy Walk. His home stood a few hundred feet to the south of the mill, though all that remains in its place is his overgrown basement.
There's ruins of a basement here. You can see the stonework on the sides. It was more defined in earlier times, but now it's pretty much full of debris, leaves, and people that camp here use it as a junk pile.
The final ruin before we get to Lausanne itself is this stone structure, a third powder magazine by the DuPont company built around 15 years after the first two. This one came along in 1852.
Probably these were discontinued, yeah, I think I said around 1869, 1870, and I'm thinking because there were powder magazines that were constructed along the line of the Nesquehoning Valley Railroad, at least for the Nesquehoning mines. And so they would have replaced these.
So these were roughly from the 1830s to the 1870s?
Yes, I believe so.
Which is roughly the era of the sawmill?
The turnpike, yeah, and the turnpikes too.
Okay.
This section of the turnpike was discontinued in 1869. I think this particular location, and I've always been impressed by those line of pine trees that grow in a line. It seems to me that was man-made, but I think in this location here is where the Warriors Path came up over the Pisgah Mountain and split. The west trail going up to Nescopec and the east trail going up to Wyoming, which is now Wilkes-Barre. And then from then on, it continued all the way up to Canada. And that was the trail over which the Gilbert family was taken when they were kidnapped in the 1780s.
A mere half a mile farther, and we were finally at the old location of Lausanne. The actual town site of Lausanne is a bit underwhelming to look at. As I said, there's nothing left of the old town. It's now buried under thousands and thousands of tons of rubble, filled in by the railroad constructing a rail yard in the spot.
Somebody found something. It could be from a lock gate, could be from a boat. We just don't know.
Coming into Lausanne now, we're actually approaching from the south along the Lehigh River. To get to the town, we first have to pass under a railroad bridge. I've crossed this bridge before, several times in the last few years, aboard the Lehigh Gorge Scenic Railway. Every time I rode on the train, I knew we were passing Lausanne, but I always wondered what could still be found of the town. This bridge was built in the 1950s to replace an older bridge.
And up there you can see the abutments of the original bridge that was put in around 1865.
Continuing on, we finally reached Lausanne itself. With the opening of the turnpike in 1806, the path that we just walked to get here, several taverns were constructed along the road, offering food and rest for weary travelers. The most popular tavern along the turnpike was right here in Lausanne.
Buried under that bank to where the tavern most likely was located. The river, according to the maps, the river was up almost to the level of the tavern. So I would put it back further because the river is low right now.
This tavern was known as the Landing Tavern, as it serviced not only the turnpike travelers, but boatmen working along the river. The first operator of the tavern was a man named Abraham Klotz, who was known for his warm hospitality, good food, and his storytelling. The tavern was a 40-foot tall structure and made of wood. It had several outbuildings, including a kitchen attached to the tavern and 2 large sheds, which likely served partly as a garage and stable, in addition to general storage. There was also a general store either attached to the tavern or just beside it. The tavern operated for decades, with several documented births and deaths occurring within its doors. It was a common stopping point for Quakers moving north and west, and even for workers who were developing the rivers and lands around Lausanne and Mauch Chunk. As the use of the turnpike died as people favored the now expanding railroads, Lausanne began to die with it, even before Lausanne really became anything, and the tavern declined. It was seized for back taxes several times and sold in sheriff's auctions, struggling to stay in business through the 1860s. But the death blow came in 1869 when this portion of the turnpike was completely abandoned. The railroad bridge, whose abutments we saw earlier, was in full operation, and there simply was no demand for a turnpike or the tavern anymore. The abandoned portion of the road was still traveled on occasionally, but because maintenance had stopped and there were now bandits along the route, this became known as the worst public road in America.
This part of the turnpike was abandoned in 1869. Well, officially abandoned. I mean, the road was still used because the Broad Mountain was a dangerous road to travel. There were a lot of cases of people missing, finding dead bodies and skeletons on the Broad Mountain. So in the wintertime and at night, it was a dangerous road to travel.
The tavern was fully abandoned in 1873, although interestingly, a wedding was held here in the abandoned ruins in the late 1870s. Squatters remained at the tavern and in other Lausanne ruins for decades.
Right here we're exploring where the Landing Tavern was located, and there's absolutely nothing left that remains of it. In fact, by the 1910s, it was already said that there wasn't anything left of the building.
And today, anything that may have been left is now buried under this bridge abutment built in 2019. From the tavern landing site, we moved deeper into the old town site, seeking out the location of one of the only other significant structures ever built in Lausanne, the old sawmill, which was the reason the whole town ever existed. This is a completely different sawmill than the stone ruin that we saw at the James Run site along the turnpike here. To get to the Lausanne one, it's quite a trek up a man-made hill to a train track.
This road was put in when they were building the new bridge.
This track was originally laid down in 1869 for the Lehigh and Susquehanna Railroad, which helped to link the Pennsylvania towns of Easton and Whitehaven and made the Lehigh and Susquehanna Turnpike obsolete. This was the last straw that led to the complete abandonment of the Lausanne Turnpike. This railroad completely killed off the town of Lausanne, and it even had the courtesy of burying it.
Tens of thousands of tons of waste from the coal breakers were dumped here to expand the railroad yard here.
On top of this piling where we now stand was once a train yard.
So there's one track over there, and that was the original point that the railroad went through. Anything from that point on was all filled in here to make this expanded freight yard here. And that happened around 1913 up into the 1920s.
The ground that we are walking on was artificially piled up here, burying Lausanne 50 feet beneath our shoes.
That close.
That is the natural level down there.
Yes, that's the natural level. That's correct.
So Lausanne.
So what do you estimate the elevation difference?
Oh yeah,
I'm not good at that.
50 feet.
50 feet easily.
That's a good 50 feet.
Yeah.
Lausanne is on that level under the rail yard.
That's correct. The village was more down at the lower end, underneath all of the hill. This upper end had the sawmill.
We'd need to descend back down the hillside to approach the far western end of the town plot. Heading along the deer path, we passed another site of interest. It wasn't related to Lausanne itself, but it's another structure of historical significance and a reminder of the absolute dominance that the coal mining industry had over this region's fate. This drainage tunnel was built between 1906 and 1912. It might not look like much, but the looks are deceiving. This tunnel is 14 miles long. As the coal mines in the mountains drove deeper and deeper, flooding became a significant problem, and this tunnel was built to allow the water to drain out.
As the deep mines in the anthracite region went deeper and deeper, and that was particularly true in this region because some of the veins were almost vertical, more and more water began accumulating in the mines, both from rainwater and from normal underground water tables. And so, I guess around the turn of the century, around 1900, they were hauling up from underground 12 tons of water for every single ton of coal. Very, very expensive. So they decided to drill a drainage tunnel from this point west, southwest, underneath the Nesquehoning mines and the Panther Valley mines, and that would help drain and alleviate the cost of mining coal.
The problem is now, over a century later, the waste from the mine is still flowing out, which necessitated the construction of a man-made wetlands on the Lausanne town site to filter pollutants out of the water. Those wetlands absolutely obliterated anything that was left on this end of the town, and the railroad bridges destroyed anything that remained on the other side of town. Lausanne has been completely erased.
A side story, when I was a kid, going down to the library and doing research, the librarian handed me a clipping, and this clipping was about some hunters that had been on the Broad Mountain hunting, and they got caught in a rainstorm. And they came down the mountain and found a cave that they could shelter in, and the cave was full of Indian artifacts.
We continued down into the wetlands, knowing that we wouldn't see much, but we found that the old mill race did still run through it. This mill race drove the water wheel at the old sawmill, which powered the saw itself.
I believe the Union sawmill was located south of the tunnel entrance, underneath the fill back in there.
It's only a best guess, but that sawmill would have been right about here.
So down here in the area of the sawmill, absolutely nothing of the original terrain still exists. This has all been modified to fill in for the rail yard and to produce these wetlands down here. So the hills that we would have seen around the sawmill, you don't see it anymore. The sawmill itself is buried. There's not even a trace of the old mill race. So this has been completely terraformed to make something totally different than it was 150 years ago.
Aside from the tavern, the sawmill at Lausanne was the main industry of the town. The sawmill was first built by Jacob Weiss in the early 1780s, and he named it the Union Sawmill. No doubt this was out of a sense of patriotism, as the construction of the mill coincided with the American victory during the Revolutionary War and the start of the United States. This etching isn't confirmed 100% to be that of the Lausanne sawmill, but the evidence points to it. It was drawn by famous American painter Frederick de Bourgh Richards, and was done around the time as when he was doing a painting of Mauch Chunk just down the river. Richards was good friends with one of the owners of the Lausanne tavern, and it's possible that he stayed there. So there's a very good chance that this is the old Union sawmill. The mill was productive, and as explained earlier, it was one of the major reasons why the roads and turnpikes through the Nesquehoning Valley were routed this way. The sawmill business was straightforward at first. They cut wood and shipped it downriver to the cities to market. But as the coal mines were developed in the mountains to the west, the coal companies also needed their product to be shipped down to the big cities, and the river offered the best way of doing so. The Union sawmill got into the business of creating coal barges known as river arcs.
The arcs were built at Lausanne because, of course, the Union sawmill was located there. There was no other sawmills around. And as far as the size, I think they were probably maybe 20 by 50 or something like that.
These boats were single use only. The sawmill built the boat, loaded it up with coal, and when it got to cities such as Philadelphia, the coal was sold off and the boats were dismantled.
They were wood, they were taken apart in Philadelphia, and the wood was sold in Philadelphia, and the hardware was returned to Mauch Chunk,
where it was reused with fresh lumber to build a new ark. The ark trips were difficult and often precarious, with a large ark trip from Lausanne in 1814 being the most famous.
So in 1814, they had the company that was operating the Summit Hill mines was the Lehigh Coal Mine Company. And their contract specified that they had to get, I think it was 5,000 bushels of coal to market each year. Well, it was August of 1814 and they hadn't shipped any coal. So they came to Lausanne and they built some arks and they quote unquote prayed for a freshet, what they called a flood. And to me, it's bizarre because August is the worst year. August generally looks like this, hardly any river. Well, they did get a freshet and they supposedly released 5 boats and immediately downriver, one of the boats wrecked. And one of the famous stories is that the ark pilot stripped all his clothes off and used them to plug the hole in the ark. It was 1 or 2 boats that made it all the way to Philadelphia. But anyway, that coal then brought Josiah White and Erskine Hazard into the picture. They bought some of the coal, used it in their mills at the falls of the Schuylkill, and that was what brought them to the Lehigh region in 1818. They settled Mauch Chunk, formed the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company, and changed American history. Some historians claim that it was that coal that sparked America's Industrial Revolution.
Really?
Yes.
That specific shipment?
That specific shipment, yes.
And that came right out of Lausanne?
Well, the arks were made at Lausanne,
yeah.
But the coal came from Summit Hill.
Right.
Eventually, the coal companies themselves set up sawmills and boat-building yards in Mauch Chunk and took over the production of the coal arks, and the Union sawmill faded into obscurity. It's not known when it was abandoned, but whatever remained is almost certainly buried beneath the wetlands here. There's only one known photograph of Lausanne, and it's this view from atop a nearby mountain looking down on the Lehigh River and the old 1860s railroad bridge that spanned it. To the left of the bridge, we can see various buildings, including the sawmill, and what may be the landing tavern. This building right here may be a home that's been referred to in diaries as the White House. The bridge itself was built in the 1860s and no longer exists. We can still see the stone abutments on either end of it. Lausanne had never developed into a major town with anything more than perhaps a dozen inhabitants. A couple houses were built, including the White House seen in the photograph, but very little is known about these structures. We do, however, know some of the names of the people who lived here. The Fahey family resided in Lausanne in the 1870s. And their young child was lost in a fire inside of their house here, possibly the one in the photograph. There are no known graveyards or other reminders of the past here, not even an old historical marker or info board. The town had a post office that operated briefly, likely out of the tavern, and some of the postmarks from letters survive today.
And I think the post office was discontinued in the 1850s because they just weren't getting enough mail in the small town.
But aside from a few ephemeral artifacts, the story of Lausanne has completely closed, and the people who worked so hard to develop it into something special are long since buried, as is their old home. If you ride the Lehigh Gorge Scenic Railway, be sure to look out to the side as you cross the bridge over the Lehigh River and think back on the town that never got its fair chance. This whole video was possible thanks to the extensive research done by Vince.
My name's Vince Hydro. I'm from the area, originally from Nesquehoning, now living in Jim Thorpe. And all my life I've been interested in local history. I started writing about it in 1971, and in 2019 I started my own publication house. And I've self-published 5 books on local history, including my most recent one, which is the history of the village of Lausanne. If you're in Jim Thorpe, you could find it at Sellers Bookshop on Broadway. It's also for sale in the Dimmock Memorial Library. If you come to any of my presentations at the Nesquehoning Historical Society, they're for sale there, and they are on Amazon. You just have to search Vince Hydro Books.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and share the video around. Be sure to also visit my Patreon at the link below, or consider signing up for my YouTube channel memberships. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankerts, Gabriel Colomb, RGB, Tara Mullakar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Fraser, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarkey, Sam Forker, Busy Bee, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Buick, Brian Reedy, Eden Cleefish, Bless Moles, Coda Yoda 16, Carol Adams, Clay Hobbs, Steve Valley, Gojira's Trains, J.C. Hobbs, High Treason, The Peppermilk, Tristan White, Jason Stray, Chance Hudson, Robert Mayer III, and Jordan Page.